Thank you, Jonathan. Thanks, guys. On Mothering Sunday, it's a strange Sunday in some ways, I think, for me. That sort of sense of the roots of Mothering Sunday is actually set back in a time when people didn't have cars. They would tend to live in one village and never move terribly far from that village. And some of us are still a bit like that, but most of us actually are not in these days. And Mothering Sunday was the day when people would go home. There was a holiday. It was one of the few holidays of the year where the people who tended to work the fields and that kind of thing would go back to what they saw as the family home, and on the Sunday would go to the place that was seen as the family church. So it was a time of gathering together. It was a time of getting people together. It was a time of coming back together in the midst of those things. And one of the things that really strikes me about us in these days is that our families have become more diverse, haven't they? And they've become more spread. And that sense of gathering together still happens at certain times and certain occasions for most of us. But in all sorts of ways, those things are spread further. And for a number of you in church this morning, actually, something like Mother's Day or Mothering Sunday, it has that tinge of memories which are sad in one sense because our mum has died and passed on and is in heaven now, is in God's safe keeping now. And so it reminds us of those. And then with all those sad memories come all those wonderful good memories as well. And for some of us, our relationships with our parents are better than others. That's a statement of fact, isn't it, in the midst of those things. So there are all sorts of things that are gathered up in this. And this morning, I just want to point you in just one direction and remind you that Jesus was brought up by a mum. And that he was fed, he was looked after, he was directed by a mum, and her name was Mary. And in our stream of church, we tend to just sideline Mary a little bit. But for years, in all the years that we don't know exactly what Jesus was doing, he had a mum who looked after him, and he will have appreciated her. Isn't that a lovely sound on Mothering Sunday? Did you pinch her just at the right time for me, Evie? In the midst of those things. All that care, all that love, all that beauty that's wrapped up in those things. And it's a difficult thing to actually get a grasp of and physically make things happen around it. So what we do is we want to give a flower to every lady in the congregation. Every girl, every woman in the congregation. And we've bought, we reckon, about twice as many as there are ladies in the congregation this morning. And we want to affirm that sense of care and of love and of joining in and of joining together, because even if you don't have children of your own, there are children around you this morning who are precious, and just you being here and the way you are and the things that you sow are part of what goes to form each and every one of us. Right? But there is a cry here, there is a cry that every minister always says, I need help. I need wisdom, I need a few other things, but I especially need help. So, kids, do you fancy coming and helping me to give out the flowers? We kind of need one or two strong people to carry them, and then we need other people to give them out. So every lady should have one. And we want to say to you this morning, if you're in contact with another lady, in close contact with someone who doesn't come to church, maybe a neighbour, maybe a friend, maybe someone who you're going to go and see this afternoon, maybe someone you'll bump into, then take an extra flower for them too. Take it as a gift, just a simple, loving, free gift for someone else, so that they too can experience that sense of joy, that sense of wonder in those things. So do that. If you've got neighbours or friends who you think would just appreciate, go. Squeeze one back all the way to the back. Can you get all the way to the back and then start from the back? Would that be easier? Well done. Thanks, gang. That's brilliant. I know what they're like. They'll be sitting here later on when they're meant to be listening to me, and they'll be thinking, I should have taken one for Auntie so-and-so or so-and-so down the road. I could have taken one. So those that are left when you leave this morning, you're very welcome to take one for that neighbour, for that friend, for that relative. Otherwise, there'll be loads of them out in the grounds, which would be lovely too. Just going to stop and take a moment to pray. And with these thoughts about the fact that we're all shaped by the relationships we have, and perhaps by no relationship more strongly than the one we have with our mothers, whether that's been a strong bond or whether that's been a weak bond, it has shaped us in a really strong and powerful way. So we're going to take a moment to acknowledge that, to remember that, and to say before God, thank you for whatever circumstances we have received. And then also just to catch up the fact that God himself allowed himself to be mothered, to be brought up by a mum. Lord God, this morning we come with all sorts of things in our hearts on Mothering Sunday. For some of us it's quite a tough day. Perhaps our emotions are actually quite raw this morning, and we come with all sorts of memories, and the softness of our emotions is very close to the surface. And Lord, as we do that, we want to acknowledge and thank you that you made us with those emotions. That's a part of who we are. And that's not a bad thing in itself. Lord, we do thank you for the nurturing that we have received. Lord, even for those of us that think that actually we could have had better things sown in our lives, we still stop and say thank you for the way we have been nurtured. Lord, for some of us this morning, for one or two of us this morning, those bonds have broken down in ways that are hurtful and harmful. And this morning we come and we confess that to you. We wish that it was not so. Lord, we ask that you give us the humility to do something about it, to take an action, maybe to take one of these flowers and to pass it on as a token, as a gesture of seeking to make things a different way for the future. Lord, for a good number of us this morning, we are left with our memories only now, perhaps some pictures, but some memories of days that have gone by in our lives. And Lord, for all the good things that have been sown on in us, we ask that you would help us to share them with the lives of the people that are sitting around us now. And for all those things that have not been good that have been sown in us, help us to take those and learn from them, so that those mistakes can be overridden, that your love can enter in and change and transform us and those that are around us. Lord, we thank you for the way Mother's Day imposes itself on us once a year, stops us and makes us think in a different way. And this morning, as we share this time together, when we think about voices, when we think about listening, we ask that you would help us to listen first and foremost to you, but in the knowledge that you speak through those that are around us too. Lord, it's a long prayer I've prayed, but we bring it to you in love. Amen. We're into the second half of Lent already. It's March already. Time just whistles by, don't you? That's life, isn't it? Blink and you'll miss it, in the sense of all those different things. We began Lent, if you remember, by looking at what God said to the very first human being that he created. We looked at those words that he said to Adam. The second week, we had Geraldine Latty with us. We were thinking about voices and using our voices in song. She was such a gift and such an encouragement. And in one of the conversations I was having with Jonathan, the thing that really impressed me about Geraldine Latty, okay, she was a gifted musician and all of that kind of stuff, but for 10 hours on the Saturday, she just encouraged us. She was just positive for 10 full hours. That takes some kind of energy, or takes some kind of gift or some kind of person, doesn't it, to be like that? Perhaps if you're a school teacher, you know something of that kind of race of encouragement that you can be to people. But such a gift to us, and using our voices to respond to God in worship. And then last week, Stuart spoke, I believe, about Elijah. Does it ring any bells? Still small voice, all of that kind of stuff. That's good. I wanted to check that because I'm going to go with Elijah as well this morning. But this morning, I thought we'd just unpack a slightly different thing about listening, a slightly different thing about voices. And the question that's been running around my mind before we came to Lent and all that sort of thing was this. What do we do when God goes quiet? What do we do when it seems that God has nothing to say? What do we do when actually we're asking God to speak to us, we're putting ourselves in the place where we believe God should be speaking to us, but it just feels as though God is silent. It feels as though God is inactive. And there are different places we could go to in the Bible. In the story of Job, it says that he cries out to God. And God does not answer him. His friends come and talk to him, but he cries out to God and God does not answer him. I was reminded this week that in the story of Esther, God isn't even mentioned in the story. And yet you can see something of God's fingerprints through the actions that are played out in Esther's life. But this week I want us to take us back to that story, and the little bit before the still small voice. It's in the book of 1 Kings, if you've got a Bible with you. I think I've shut it without marking it in my Bible. That's not a very good thing to do, is it? 1 Kings, about chapter 16, about chapter 17, about chapter 18. I'm not going to read them all. But there's if you go back a couple of chapters to about chapter 14, 15, it's a bit like sort of, Ancestry UK, who do you think you are? It lists the kings as they come through their reigns. Rehoboam, king of Judah, 1 Kings 14, 1 Kings 15, Abijah, king of Judah. Halfway through 1 Kings 15, Asa, king of Judah. At the end of, 2/3 of the way through chapter 15, Nadab, king of Israel. And then on to verse 33 of chapter 15, and Baasha, king of Israel. And it just gives a very brief potted history of all these people. Chapter 16, Elah, king of Israel. Zimri, king of Israel. Omri, king of Israel. And then there's a bit of a spiel about who they are and what they do and this kind of thing. And then a man called Ahab becomes king of Israel, 1 Kings 16 and verse 29. And this is what it says about King Ahab. In the 38th year of Asa, king of Judah, Ahab, son of Omri, became king of Israel. And he reigned in Samaria over Israel for 22 years. Ahab, son of Omri, did more evil in the eyes of the Lord than any of those before him. So all that list, all those people that came before him, he did more evil in the eyes of the Lord than any of those before him. He not only considered it trivial to commit the sins of Jeroboam, son of Nebat, but he also married Jezebel, daughter of Ethbaal, king of the Sidonians, and began to serve Baal and worship him. He set up an altar for Baal in the temple of Baal that he built in Samaria. Ahab also made an Asherah pole and did more to arouse the anger of the Lord, the God of Israel, than did all the kings of Israel before him. Then at the beginning of chapter 17, Elijah appears, and I confess to you, I like Elijah. I like Elijah a lot. But at this point of the story, I'm quite glad I'm not Elijah, because God gives him a message which is dangerous, unpalatable. It's not a glad, happy message. Elijah the Tishbite from Tishbe in Gilead said to Ahab, "As the Lord, the God of Israel lives, whom I serve, there will be neither dew nor rain in the next few years, except at my word. That's a bold thing to proclaim, isn't it? All of this evil that's going on, the worship of the gods of money and sex essentially is the kind of tone of where that goes. I'm not going to unpack all of that. All of that stuff which is abhorrent to God. Elijah is the man who has to stand before the king and say to him, it's your fault really, but there's going to be no rain, there's going to be no dew in the morning until I say so. There will come a time when God will say through me that it's time for the rains to come again. But in the meantime, this is what's happening in this land where you are king. There's then a story which follows, which is a story, if you know your Bibles well, you'll know it. If you don't know your Bibles well, it's an interesting story to look at. But sort of immediately after that, there's a story of provision, God's provision for Elijah, through a widow in a place called Zarephath, who has a simple cruse of oil that as she uses it to bake, it just never runs out. And there's a sense of God's provision in that. And then God takes Elijah away to another place still, and there's a period of silence. At the beginning of chapter 18, these are the words that it starts with. The first 4 words it says is this: after a long time. So the story goes dead for a long time. And it's a story of a place that's dry, it's a story of a place that's difficult, it's a story of a place where there's a reliance on God, but God is not speaking. And I don't know whether you've been in that kind of place. The place where you just feel dry. Just where you'd long to have a mouthful of water. After a long time, in the 3rd year, the word of the Lord came to Elijah. It's time to go. Go and present yourself to Ahab, and I will send rain on the land. So Elijah went to present himself to Ahab. After a long time, having declared a message which actually was unpalatable to the king. For Elijah, these days must have been destabilizing. He is a well-known, perhaps too well-known prophet of God. And the fact that he carries some of the responsibility for the famine in the land, that he's the one who's declared God's judgment, the king, and more especially the king's wife, have been trying to hunt him down to kill him. That's a story which will repeat itself in the story of Elijah. And for Elijah, this is a long time. This is a place where it is not easy to follow God or to hear him. What should we do? What should we do in the times of silence? In the times before the miracles of God come into our lives. If you're following the handout, I've got 4 things to suggest, and I've got 3 things which I don't think I've done slides for at the end of it. But I want to encourage you with these things that just come out of Elijah's story. And the first one is this: keep your experiences of God in mind. The things that you have already experienced. Perhaps that first time when you realised actually you belonged not to yourself but to God. Keep that in mind. Perhaps that great excitement of finding God. That sense of the friendships and the groups that you were a part of that encouraged you in such a positive direction. Keep that in mind. In my college days, we had a tutor, and 1 or 2 of you know him very well, because you were part of a church where he was at one stage. But he had problems today we categorise them as he had mental health problems, and it would be as simply said as that. He went through times of great depression. He went through times that were just difficult, where God was silent and he was low, and actually there wasn't a lot he could do about it. And he experienced that in his ministry. He got to a point, and I remember him just sort of sitting and talking with 4 or 5 of us in college. He got to the point where he found it difficult to live at home with his wife. He found a boat on the river, and he would sleep in the boat on the river, and he didn't want to have anything to do with anybody. And he just wasn't quite sure what to do. God was silent in his life. And he went through he still goes through these kind of periods, not in the same depth, but in this time in his life, he was at this lowest of low. And we kind of said, oh, what happened? And he points to a moment which actually unlocked a door for him. And it was very much about what we're going to experience together this morning, communion. Lying in that boat, he had that sense, it's a horrible picture, of the blood of Jesus just seeping through the boat and covering him. And at that moment, he knew that he was absorbed into God, he was encouraged into God and all those. But the problem was this, right? Because even though he had that touch of God in his life, even though there came a day when all of that emptiness was sort of, God was setting it aside, he was still a minister of a church. He still had to get up and try and lead people to God from a place where he felt empty and a place where he wasn't sure what he would do. And I found out from conversations with people who are in this room today that actually what happened was there was a fella in that church, a wise older man, who said simply this to him: do you remember how it was when you were first called? Do you remember how it was when you had that sense of excitement about what God was doing? Remember what you did then, and just go back and do that again. I know that you're in a place where you're empty. I know you're in a place where you're not quite sure what to do, but just go back and do what you used to do. And the story is that over a few months, actually God filled him up again. And after that time of emptiness, and because he went back just simply to the places that he had been, he was filled again. The second thing that I want to point out to you in this story is simply this. Confronting evil is part of God's plan. We're not very good at this today. We'd rather skate round it. We'd rather use polite language. But part of what Elijah has to do is stand up and say, this is wrong. And that means that certain things happen before God. This is wrong. I think there's a deeper thing for us as individuals here as well. In those places, in those times when we feel furthest away from God, one of the great dangers is that what has cut us off is sin. That what has caused the barrier is the things that God stands against, the things that God is not pleased with, the things that God is not happy about. And actually, it's not just about judging the things that are wrong in the world around us. It's about being honest with ourselves and confronting our own sin. So confronting that evil is a personal thing as well as a public thing. And this morning, if you've come to church and thought, whoa, this is me, I don't feel as though God's speaking to me, I feel as though God is silent, I feel as though God is absent, then I need to just poke you here and say, is this the area that you need to do some business with God? Is there something in your life actually which it's about you cutting yourself off through the actions you're involved in, through the attitudes you're carrying, through the things that you are involved in? There's a phrase, you've probably heard it before. You can't run with the hare and hunt with the hounds. Your personal holiness, you can't have a foot in both camps. In the ambitions of your life, you can't serve two masters. Not to decide is to decide. This morning, as we examine ourselves, we have a decision to make, we have a choice to make. And each and every one of us, whether we see it as a black and white decision, we do have choices to make. And the biggest choice of all is, whose side are you on? Are you living yourself with that orientation that says, in everything I experience in life, whether it's good, bad, ugly, indifferent, whose side am I on? Who am I living this for? Elijah's quite clear, isn't he? All the way through. A servant of the Lord. And that's how he sees himself. That's how he understands himself. That's his identity. And that's a choice that each and every one of us makes. things. And it's a choice that will shape every minute, every hour, every year, every decade of your life. I still say without any shame, it's the best decision, best choice I ever made. But I know that I get things wrong along the road. Each and every one of us this morning has to make that decision. And a fourth thing I just want to point out to you in this, it's not recorded heavily in the story of Elijah, but I found someone else's words and just really were caught by them. I want you to consider the benefits of the toughest times. I want you to consider the benefits of actually when God doesn't speak. I think there are probably times when most of us would say, well, actually, I'd rather God didn't speak, because if he speaks, I've got to do something about it. Leave me alone, God, I'd like to get on my life my own way, is quite that's the way of the world, isn't it, these days? That's the way, and that's the way that some of us as Christians, I've got myself into this nice, lovely routine that feels quite comfortable, so leave me alone. But what about these things? Why is it that absence makes the heart grow fonder? Why is it that something in that separation stirs us emotionally? And yet at the same time, it can work the other way, and familiarity can breed contempt. Why is water so much more refreshing when we're really, really thirsty? Why was it when I was a teenager that when the milk float went past after we'd been playing football for 2 hours, that pint of milk just tasted so good? Why am I almost never satisfied with what I've got? Why am I always longing for more? Why can the thought of being denied a desire for marriage or children or freedom or some other dream create in us a desperation, a strength of desire that we didn't previously have? Why is it that the pursuit of success, and it's the pursuit that seems to be more enjoyable than the actual achievement or the success itself? Why is it that deprivation, adversity, scarcity, suffering often produce the best character qualities in us? Why is it that being at ease and having lots of stuff seems to produce the worst character qualities in us? Tough times are tough. God being silent means that we don't hear. But there is a growth in that time, in the perseverance of the putting of one foot in front of the other. I want to finish. If you've got the handout, I've got 3 little slides. I don't know whether Mike's managed to pull anything together for you. No, I don't. I didn't expect it. But in the sense of that, this is what I want to say to you at the end of this morning. The measure of your worth is not in how gifted you are. It's not in how great you can do these things and those things. And the measure of your worth is not in how much you've succeeded, in what you've built, in how much you've garnered, in how much you've collected. The measure of your worth is simply in your faith in God. This is an eternal truth. Others won't measure you this way, but this is how God measures you. The measure of your worth is your faith. For me, it's no coincidence that a month later I'm finishing talking about faith at a communion service. We talked about preparing ourselves for miracles a month ago, and I've been on a bit of a journey with that sermon. It's one of those where it's often the case you preach a sermon and then you discover what you left out after you've preached it, and how much more there is that you could have said. But coming back to this sense of the measure of your worth is your faith, is this. And I want you to think about this. There's a number of stories where Jesus is involved. I don't like using the word stories. It sounds as though they're only half-truths, doesn't it? There are a number of accounts of Jesus with his disciples talking to them about faith. And he talks to them about, you'll do more marvellous things than I did. You'll heal people. And his disciples just kind of accept it. And then he says, you'll raise people from the dead. And his disciples just kind of accept that that's the way it is. And he says this, have faith in God. Truly I tell you, if anyone says to a mountain, go and throw yourself in the sea, and does not doubt in their heart, but believes that what they say will happen, it will be done for them. And the disciples kind of don't appear to bat an eyelid. I tell you, whatever you ask for in prayer, believe that you've received and it will be yours. And when you stand praying, he then introduces a whole different seam of things about faith. This is what he says. If you hold anything against anyone, forgive them, so that your Father in heaven may forgive your sins. That's as big as moving a mountain. And that was the stumbling block. That was the bit around which the disciples say, "Whoa, hang on a minute. I can go and move some mountains. I can raise people from the dead. I can heal people. That's okay. But you want me to forgive people? You need me to forgive people in that way." The measure of your life this morning is not on what you achieve. It's not on whether we did a big building project. The measure of your worth is not about success or your feelings. The measure of your worth is your faith. And in this time where God appears not to be speaking, the most important thing you can do with your faith is to pay attention to your relationship with God and your relationship with other people. Lord God, this morning here in this place, we come to you as people who are failures in all sorts of ways. We are not perfect. We get things wrong. Sometimes we get quite big things wrong. We hurt the people that we care about deeply. We put off people with our attitudes, with our words, with our ways, and your love is not seen to be put first. And this morning, here and now, as we approach a table which speaks of your sacrifice for us, your love for us, your perfection given up, handed over, submitted to human death, Lord, we feel a little bit ashamed. For what Elijah was a long time, the experts say maybe 3 years of silence, maybe 4 years of silence, where he just didn't hear anything from you, wasn't able to speak anything for you. A time of dryness, a time of barrenness. At the end of that time, he still knew that he belonged to you. At the end of that time, his faith was deeper than it was at the beginning of that time. Lord, as it was for Elijah, let it be for us. We ask this in your precious name. Amen.